there are clear differences between the roles and the responsibilities of both men and women in marriage. Traditional Muslim legal scholars in particular saw the differences in the rights that men and women had within marriage and the responsibilities that men and women had within marriage as being a balance. Right? Today, that is being readdressed and re-examined by Muslim women who obviously are living in a very different kind of situation than they were in the past. In the time of Muhammad and really up until modern times, women were really completely dependent on men. It's not like women could go off and live on their own and get a job and be independent. That just really wasn't a possibility. And so given that they were so dependent on men in that way, and men therefore had a great responsibility toward women and taking care of them, they also had greater rights. That's how it was understood by classical Islamic legal scholars. The question is today, that's not the situation, even for many women in the Muslim world who go to school, who work, who participate in professional life. And the question is, do some of these things still apply? Right? That's something that's being questioned today. But just looking, in fact, at what the Quran says about marriage, as I said, when it talks about the purpose of marriage, it never mentions that the purpose of marriage is procreation. And in fact, the Quran says your children are a trial for you. Right? My husband sometimes jokes, they never mention children in paradise. Why is that? They're a lot of work. But for example, you have this very famous passage. It's often read when people are married in Muslim ceremonies. And among his signs, meaning God's signs, is that he created mates for you from among yourselves, that you might find rest in them. And he established affection and mercy between you. Truly in that are signs for a people who reflect. So marriage is for the sake of love and mercy and comfort for both parties. Right? As I said, having children is a very good thing traditionally in Islam, like lots of other traditional cultures. But the Quran doesn't mention that specifically, right? It talks about marriage as being something predominantly for the two parties. There's also a very beautiful passage where it's talking about exactly this part that I was mentioning, where it says that men can have sexual relations with their wives on the nights of the fast during Ramadan. And it concludes that by saying that your wives are a garment for you and you are a garment for them. And it's a really beautiful kind of mutual description of marriage. When you think about what a garment does, right? It protects, it keeps you warm, it keeps you comfortable, it's ennobling, right? It covers the things that you would not want to show in public, right? So in other words, those are the responsibilities that both men and women in a marriage are to have in relation to one another. Okay. But at the same time, as Islamic marriage is conceived, men have the full responsibility for supporting their wives and for supporting any children, of course, that result from the marriage, as well as supporting any female relatives who do not have other sources of support, say nieces, cousins, sisters, etc., right? Other female relatives. And this was considered to be a big burden, right, to take care of them. So women did have access to money, not the same access that men had, or to income, because when women got married, their husbands had to give them a bridal gift, sometimes called a dowry. We often associate a dowry with the other thing, right, with women giving it to the men's family. But a man had to give the gift to the wife, not to her family, to her, to be her own property that was inalienable. And women also could inherit, right? So women didn't go out and work every day, but they did have access. And certainly women who came from wealthy families or married into wealthy families would have had access to money. But it's clear in Islamic law that even if a woman has her own money, even if she's wealthier than her husband, she has no obligation to use that money to support the house, the household, her own upkeep, her children's upkeep. Right? So it was understood that this was fully the man's responsibility. And in exchange for that, men clearly had greater freedoms and rights within the marriage. So certainly there's a greater possibility for marriage. We know that men in Islam are allowed to marry up to 4 wives. This is the verse of the Quran at the beginning of the 4th surah, toward the beginning. It says, if you fear that you will not deal fairly with the orphans, then marry such women as seem good to you, 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear that you will not deal justly, then only 1, or those whom your right hands possess, which meant slave women, that you were supposed to marry them. Right? Thus it is more likely that you will not commit injustice. Right? Now, this verse was revealed at a time when, in fact, there were a number of battles that had happened, and a lot of men had died in battle. And you had women who were widowed, and you had orphans, as this verse alludes to. And remember that if, at this time, since women could not exist on their own, you had a lot of women who'd come from Mecca to Medina without the support of their families, married. And then if their husbands died, in a normal situation, they would be sent back to their fathers or their brothers, their paternal family members to take care of them, but they obviously couldn't. Like, they couldn't go back to Mecca. Their families would kill them. Right? So you had this situation of orphans and widows and the need to take care of them. And the verse is revealed in that particular context. Right? But I do think it's interesting to note that the verse begins and ends with a concern for justice. So if you fear that you're not going to deal fairly with the orphans, then marry such, in other words, that you might be tempted to marry them without giving them a big dowry because you're like, well, they're orphans, right? You know. Then marry the women that seem good to you, 2, 3, or 4. But if you can't deal justly with more than 1 wife, then only 1. Right? So this issue of justice was something that was very important and seems, of course, very intrinsic to the verse. Note that it doesn't say, if you're a man and you just can't be happy with 1 woman, you need a lot of variety, go ahead and marry 2, 3, or 4. That's not what it says, right? It is established as in a situation where women did need to be taken care of. For that reason, there are some Islamic thinkers, Islamic scholars, in the late 19th, early 20th century, and through today, that argue that although, this is certainly allowed in Islam, it's really to deal with a particular situation. That this isn't something that should just be done for any reason, that it really is something that should be done in a time of necessity. Yeah.
I don't really understand this, and maybe like where it says, if you fear that you will not deal fairly with the orphans, but then later it says, but if you fear that you will not deal justly. Is it supposed to say, but if you fear that you, I don't understand why they're both in the negative.
In other words, you might not deal fairly with the orphans because you might, for example, be tempted to either marry the orphans in your care yourself, or marry them off to other people for a very low dowry, right, which would be unjust. Or the second issue of justice is if you have 2, 3, or 4 and you won't be able to deal justly with them. There's several explanations for this because of the way it's worded. One of them is that when you had, it's of course in Islam very meritorious to take in orphans and to raise them not as your own children but as foster children. That's a very meritorious thing to do in Islam. So people would take in these orphans, but then they, which would require a lot of money on their part, if they took a large number of wives, then they wouldn't really be able to fairly support everybody, right? That they would be taking from some people. So some people read 2, 3, or 4 as a limit, because there were no limits on how many wives you could marry prior to this, right? So you can marry up to 4. But even if you can't deal fairly with those 4, then only 1, right? If you can't fairly support those 4 women. And later in this same surah, there's a verse that says you will never be able to deal fairly among your wives, right? Because the idea is you certainly could deal, in quantitative things, you could deal fairly among your wives. You could say, I'm going to spend the same amount of time with each wife. I'm going to give the same amount of money to each wife. I'm going to if I bring a gift for one, I'm going to bring the same gift for all of them, right? You could easily do that kind of a thing. But you couldn't necessarily guarantee that a man was really going to love one woman and all the other women equally, right? Love is a non-quantifiable thing. But when people made this argument starting in the early 20th century that polygamy maybe really doesn't have a place in contemporary Muslim society, one of the arguments they would make is pointing to this thing about not being able to deal fairly with your wives. And monogamy too, I mean, it's important to understand that polygamy is not an ideal in Islam, right? This is clearly there to address a set of social problems that had resulted from war and a sort of large number of widows and orphans. Muhammad, spent most of his life in a monogamous relationship. And it said that his daughter Fatima, who I mentioned, she was married to Ali. And at one point, Ali wanted to take a second wife, and Muhammad said no. If you want to do that, you have to divorce my daughter first. Right? He didn't want his daughter living in a polygamous situation. So certainly there isn't the idea. And also, one other point that I'll make: the word in Arabic that's used to refer to a co-wife is darra, which means someone who harms your interests. Someone who brings you harm, right? So it was certainly allowed, and we also have plenty of examples it's not just in the Quran, right? We have examples of the early Muslim community doing this, and of course people still do this today, not in the numbers that they would have done in the past, but it isn't an ideal. It's not like, it's not, let's say, like the pre-reformed Mormon church where having many wives was actually a spiritual benefit. You don't have that here. It's to solve a social problem. Yes?
What does it mean?
Or those whom your right hands possess.
That meant slaves. That meant you were supposed to marry slave women. And give them the status of marriage.
Oh, so you'd be like lifting them up by marrying them?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. The situation of slave women was interesting. Because you could marry slave women. And even if you didn't marry them, if a man, which was allowed, certainly in the culture at that time broadly, if a man had a slave girl or slave woman, he could have sexual relations with her. But if she gave birth to a child, she was free. And the child was always a full heir, had exactly the same status as children he would have had with any other wife. So there were women for whom this was a path in many ways to freedom. And what I meant by freedom is that she could not be, while her master was alive, and a lot of times they would marry them, but while her master was alive, she couldn't be sold. She was like a permanent member of the family, and then she was completely free, if he passed away. So she achieved that status, and certainly her children had the full legal status of the children that the husband had with anyone else.